December 28, 1987. A man dressed in a gray suit calmly walked into a law office in Russellville, Arkansas, and opened fire. Within minutes, he would walk into 4 separate buildings, leaving a trail of dead and wounded behind him. But this wasn't the beginning of his killing spree. It was the end of something much worse, because back at his home in Dover, authorities would uncover a horror that defied belief. 14 bodies hidden around the property, each one carefully placed, some stacked like furniture. Among them were children, grandchildren, and his own wife. The man responsible, Ronald Gene Simmons, retired U.S. Air Force Master Sergeant, father of 7, and the architect of the worst family massacre in American history. For 7 days he lived in that house with the corpses of his family, eating meals, watching TV, waiting for more relatives to arrive so he could kill them too. What drives a man to exterminate his bloodline in cold calculation, and why did no one stop him? This is the true story of the Mockingbird Hill massacre, and once you hear what really happened behind the walls of that rural Arkansas home, you'll understand why even seasoned investigators still talk about it today. Ronald Gene Simmons was born on July 15, 1940, in Chicago, Illinois. His life began in turbulence, a pattern that would follow him into adulthood. His father passed away when Ronald was just 3 years old, leaving behind a grieving mother who quickly remarried. Her new husband, a military man, brought with him the strict discipline of the armed forces, a world of order and control that would shape young Ronald's understanding of authority and power. The family moved frequently, from base to base as his stepfather's career in the military advanced. This instability left Simmons feeling disconnected, often a stranger in new environments, but it also reinforced his belief in the importance of structure and discipline, values he would carry with him throughout his life. At 17, Simmons enlisted in the U.S. Navy, beginning what would become a 22-year military career. His time in the Navy set the stage for his future, offering him a sense of stability and belonging that he had never truly felt as a child. By the time he transitioned to the Air Force in the early 1960s, Simmons had become a reliable and dedicated serviceman. His military peers knew him as hard-working, methodical, and calm under pressure, traits that earned him commendations, including a Bronze Star and the Republic of Vietnam Gallantry Cross for his service during the Vietnam War. Despite his success in the military, the foundation of Simmons' personal life was already cracking. In 1960, he married Rebecca Ulibarri, a woman who would become the mother of his 7 children. From the outside, the Simmons family appeared to be the embodiment of the ideal American household: hard-working father, supportive mother, and a growing brood of children. But this image was a facade. Simmons, much like his stepfather before him, ruled his household with an iron fist. His military background influenced every aspect of family life, from the strict routines to the harsh punishments. What began as a structured environment slowly became a prison for those who lived in the Simmons household. His children, while not overtly rebellious, began to feel the suffocating grip of his control. To them, the world outside seemed distant and unknown, while within the walls of their home, Simmons dictated every moment of their existence. By the early 1980s, Simmons' oppressive rule was not the only thing driving a wedge in his family life. He had begun an illicit relationship with his 17-year-old daughter, Sheila. The investigation into the sexual abuse of his daughter was a turning point, not just for Simmons but for the entire family. It was an accusation that shook the very foundation of their existence. As the investigation gained traction, Simmons did what many criminals do when confronted with their dark actions: he fled. With Rebecca and their children in tow, he left behind the life they had known, abandoning their home in New Mexico and disappearing into the night. The Simmons family had become fugitives, but they were not running from the law alone. They were running from a dark secret that would come to define their future. In 1981, Ronald Gene Simmons made a decision that would seal the fate of his family, and ultimately his own. He uprooted his wife Rebecca and their 7 children from the relative familiarity of New Mexico and relocated them to a remote, secluded piece of land in Dover, Arkansas. At the time, Simmons had already faced allegations of horrific crimes against his own daughter. An investigation into claims of incestuous abuse had left a stain on his reputation, but more importantly, It set the wheels in motion for his desire to escape and to reassert control over his family without any outside interference. Leaving New Mexico behind wasn't just a geographical move, it was an escape from the scrutiny that threatened to expose the dark secrets lurking within his household. Arkansas, with its isolated wilderness and remote corners, promised a fresh start, far from the eyes of authorities and far from the neighbors who might notice that something wasn't right. But there would be no fresh start for this family. Instead, it marked the beginning of their deepest isolation. Mockingbird Hill, a name that conjured visions of peaceful solitude, became the site of horrors no one could have predicted. The property was a patch of land far off the beaten path, a place where the Simmons family could live in complete isolation from the outside world. The house, nestled among dense trees and nearly invisible from the road, seemed like the perfect haven for someone like Ronald Gene Simmons, a man who craved control above all else. There was no electricity in the house, no telephone, no indoor plumbing. Everything about their new life was an attempt to sever ties with the rest of society. The towering fence Simmons built around the property wasn't just for privacy, it was a barrier to the outside world. Even the neighbors who lived in close proximity to the Simmons family rarely saw them. When they did, it was often only in passing, children walking silently to the mailbox, or Simmons himself, controlling, distant, and always watching. The isolation was not just a matter of geography. Ronald Simmons created a world where no one, not even his wife or children, could break free from his grip. No one left without his say-so, and anyone who tried to defy him would pay the price. He'd mastered the art of creating a prison within a home, a family held captive not by bars, but by psychological chains. The physical landscape mirrored the emotional landscape he had cultivated, cold, detached, and devoid of warmth. Over the next few years, the family would live as though trapped inside their own home. Neighbors would later report that the children seemed almost robotic in their behavior, silent, obedient, rarely seen except for the occasional glance as they worked outside or passed by. The air around the property seemed heavy with something unspoken. There was no laughter, no joy, no warmth, only the oppressive atmosphere of a man determined to control every single aspect of his family's lives. But it wasn't just the oppressive control that made this house so suffocating. It was the quiet terror that Simmons imposed on his children, particularly his daughter Sheila. Behind closed doors, away from the prying eyes of the community, Simmons began to manipulate and abuse Sheila in ways that would haunt her for the rest of her life. His psychological hold over her, and his other children, was absolute. There was no escape, no refuge from his constant surveillance. Even when the family wasn't physically isolated, they were emotionally bound to him. It was during these years in that remote Arkansas home that Ronald Simmons' darkest tendencies began to take root. He was no longer just a controlling father. He was a predator biding his time, waiting for the moment when his twisted plans could unfold without anyone intervening. And in the isolation of Mockingbird Hill, he had the perfect environment to carry out his plan. The community around them, though small, had no idea what was happening behind those walls. They had no idea that a man who appeared so calm, so in control, was quietly destroying his family from within. The whispers of abuse, the quiet complaints from the children who were seen less and less, went unnoticed in the noise of rural life. No one knew the horrors that lay hidden in that house. In Simmons' mind, the move to Arkansas was the perfect solution. He could escape his past, erase the damage done in New Mexico, and regain full control of his family. But it was also the stage for something far more dangerous. It would take only a few more years before the growing darkness within him would lead to a tragic conclusion, one that would forever mark the family's place in American history. By the time December 1987 arrived, Simmons had already been living in his isolated fortress for nearly 6 years. The children, now older, had become more accustomed to their father's control, but the cracks in his facade were beginning to show. The abuse had escalated. The family, once just distant, was now teetering on the edge of an unimaginable catastrophe. What no one realized was that this would be the final Christmas they would all spend together. For years, Ronald Gene Simmons exercised near-total control over his family. The small, isolated home in Dover, Arkansas, was his kingdom, cut off from the rest of the world, surrounded by high fences and a thick wall of secrecy. Inside those walls, Simmons ran his home like a military operation, dictating every detail of his family's lives. No one was allowed to step out of line, and no one was free from his watchful eye. He created a world where his authority was law, and any attempts to break free were swiftly crushed. But behind the seemingly ordinary facade of this family life, there was something far more grotesque and insidious taking root. A relationship that no one outside the family knew about. A relationship so twisted that it would set the stage for a chain of events that would eventually lead to the unimaginable. The person at the center of it all, his daughter, Sheila Simmons. Sheila, like the rest of the Simmons children, had been raised in an atmosphere of strict discipline. There was no room for error, no space for independence. Every aspect of her life was dictated by her father's whims. But as she grew older, the nature of her father's control took an even darker turn. Ronald's authority over her didn't just extend to the household rules or family activities, it seeped into far more personal, invasive territory. By the early 1980s, Ronald Gene Simmons began a sexual relationship with his own daughter, Sheila. To anyone else, the idea would seem utterly unfathomable. But in the Simmons household, this abuse was just another form of his power. Sheila, manipulated and isolated by her father's influence, had nowhere to turn. The outside world was too distant, and the relationships within the family were far too broken for her to confide in anyone. Her father had become not just the head of the household but a terrifying figure of absolute control, and in that twisted reality, Sheila had no way of escaping. The truth about the incestuous relationship would eventually come to light, but not before Ronald Gene Simmons had fully entrenched his hold on the family. By 1981, when Sheila was in her early 20s, she was pregnant with her father's child. This was the breaking point. The investigation into Ronald began after concerns about Sheila's pregnancy reached local authorities, and rumors of incest began circulating. But Simmons, ever the manipulator, was prepared. Rather than face the authorities, he quickly uprooted his family and fled, moving them to a remote property in Dover, Arkansas, far from prying eyes. This was his tactic. When things became too hot to handle, he isolated his family even further. The house, now known as the Mockingbird Hill property, was far from a normal family home. It was a fortress built to protect his secrets and his power. There were no phones, no modern conveniences like plumbing, no way to communicate with the outside world. It was the perfect place for Simmons to reassert his dominance and keep his family under his thumb. The abuse didn't stop. In fact, it only deepened. The isolation of Dover gave Ronald Gene Simmons even more power over his family. He knew they couldn't escape. Where would they go? The nearest town was miles away, and no one would dare speak up. It was his word against theirs, and for the most part, his word won out. Sheila, still trapped in the poisonous web of control and manipulation, was forced to stay, but her own internal conflict must have been growing. The reality of what her father had done to her, and to the rest of her siblings, must have begun to sink in. But Sheila wasn't the only victim. The isolation wasn't just about controlling her, it was about controlling everyone. Ronald Gene Simmons' need to dominate and subjugate everyone around him left no room for rebellion or resistance. His actions grew more brazen. The entire family was under his sway, and anyone who threatened his control would feel the consequences. And yet, even as his power reached new heights, something began to shift. The law, despite Simmons' best efforts to hide his secrets, was closing in. The authorities had started to question his family's disappearance, and rumors of his abusive behavior were making their way into the community. But for Simmons, the move to Dover was the ultimate safeguard. Until December 1987, the weight of what had been building for years was finally about to be released in the most horrific way imaginable. Ronald Gene Simmons' twisted control over his family would come to a head. But what happened next, over the course of a single week in December, would go down as one of the most shocking and brutal mass murders in American history. It all began on December 22, 1987, an ordinary day on the outside. But inside Mockingbird Hill, the quiet, rural property that Ronald Gene Simmons called home, something dark and horrifying was about to unfold. Simmons had spent years cultivating a life of isolation, a life in which his control over his family was absolute. The home, A secluded house on a remote plot of land in Dover, Arkansas, was exactly the kind of place where secrets could be buried, where walls could be built, both literally and metaphorically, far away from prying eyes. It's difficult to pinpoint what triggered Simmons to snap. Perhaps it was his years of pent-up frustration, his obsessive need for control, or his belief that no one could stop him. But on that cold December night, it was clear that Simmons had made a decision. The first victims were his wife, Rebecca, and their son, Ronald Gene Simmons, Jr. Rebecca, by all accounts, was a quiet woman, resigned to the life she had built with Simmons. She was likely aware of the suffocating grip he had on their family, but she had nowhere to turn. She and Ronald had 7 children, and their home was a space where Simmons dictated everything: how they lived, what they did, and even who they saw. On that fateful night, Ronald Simmons and Rebecca had a disagreement. Something, a small trigger in the web of their long troubled marriage, set him off. There was no dramatic argument or violent exchange of words. Simmons simply grabbed a gun and shot his wife. The first shot took her life in an instant. His son, Ronald Jr., was a casualty. Next, he was shot and killed in what seemed like a rushed, yet deliberate, execution. There was no outcry, no cries for help, only silence as the bodies of his wife and son were left sprawled in their home. Simmons was already moving. His rage wasn't sated, no, it had only begun. The very next day, December 23, 1987, he turned his attention to his youngest granddaughter, Barbara, just 3 years old. She had been brought into this world by an unimaginable act of betrayal, as she was the daughter of Simmons' own daughter, Sheila. Barbara was no stranger to the tensions that surrounded the Simmons family, but she was just a child. For her, life should have been simple, full of wonder and play. But for Simmons, she was just another victim in a calculated, horrific plan. He strangled Barbara to death. There was no escape, no mercy. In an instant, his granddaughter, a young innocent life, was snuffed out, just like the others before her. And still, Simmons didn't stop. As the family came together to celebrate Christmas, he saw this as an opportunity to carry out his twisted plan. His children and grandchildren would soon begin to arrive, and each one would face a gruesome fate. Over the next few days, they would come one by one, returning home for what they thought would be a joyful holiday. They were unaware of the terror waiting for them. What should have been a reunion filled with love and laughter turned into something far more horrific. On Christmas Eve, the first of the returning family members arrived. Simmons' daughter, Loretta, and her children made their way to Mockingbird Hill, unaware that their lives would soon be extinguished. Loretta was an adult, but she was no match for the rage of a man who had already shown that he was capable of anything. Without hesitation, Simmons murdered his daughter. Loretta was gone. Just like that. Her body was added to the growing pile of victims in the house, her lifeless form just another piece in his cruel, calculated game. Next came Eddie, Simmons' son. He was the next to enter the household, and the last thing he likely expected was to be murdered in cold blood by his own father. There was no fight, no last-ditch attempt to flee. Simmons shot him dead in the same detached, methodical way he had taken the lives of the others. By now, the toll of Simmons' actions was beginning to set in. His own flesh and blood were piling up in the home, their lives snuffed out for reasons no one could understand. But Simmons wasn't stopping. His desire for control had led him to one terrifying decision after another, and with each kill, his power over the family grew. The massacre continued on Christmas morning. With the deaths of Loretta and Eddie, Simmons had already killed 6 of his family members, but there were still more on the way. His remaining children and grandchildren were expected to join them for the holiday celebrations, unaware of the bloodshed that had already taken place. As the day wore on, his remaining children began to arrive, one after another. William Simmons, Jr., his son, and his wife, Renata, came to the house, perhaps eager to spend time with their family. Simmons welcomed them in, just as he had with the others, but there would be no holiday cheer, no warm embrace. Instead, Simmons murdered them both, in cold blood, just as he had done with the rest of his family. Then came the next horrific act. The last of his children, Sheila, arrived at the house with her husband, Dennis McNulty, and their 2 children, Sylvia and Michael. Sheila, who had already suffered at the hands of her father, was greeted by the sight of death. Simmons didn't hesitate. He killed her, her husband Dennis, and their 2 young children, all within the span of moments. As the bodies piled up in the home, Simmons' twisted mission had been nearly completed. 14 lives, his own bloodline, had been destroyed in a matter of days. The family that had gathered to celebrate the holidays was now gone, erased from existence by the very man who had been their patriarch. For Simmons, the massacre was over, but the world outside Mockingbird Hill still had no idea. He lived among the corpses of his victims for days. Simmons ate his meals, watched TV, and went about his life, pretending nothing was wrong, while his family lay dead just rooms away. On the morning of December 28, 1987, Ronald Gene Simmons did something that shocked the small town of Russellville, Arkansas, and thrust his already horrific killing spree into the public eye. Up until that day, his gruesome acts of murder had been confined to the walls of his isolated home in Dover. There, over the span of a week, he had methodically and coldly wiped out 14 members of his own family, his wife, children, grandchildren, and others he had kept in his twisted grip of control. But something in Simmons was still unsettled. His thirst for destruction wasn't quenched by the blood of his family alone. Now, on this cold December day, he was about to bring his violence to the streets. He started his rampage in the most unexpected of places, a law office in the heart of Russellville. No warning, no outburst. He simply walked into the office, pulled out his gun, and opened fire. 2 people were killed in that office, innocent, unsuspecting people who had no idea that their lives were about to be violently ended by a man who was, until that moment, just a shadow in the community. Simmons didn't flee, he didn't panic, he simply moved on, as if it were routine. From there he headed to an oil company in town. The employees were just starting their day when Simmons arrived, gun in hand. In a flash he shot 1 man, leaving the victim wounded but alive. For Simmons, it didn't matter who was in his path. He was bent on revenge. Revenge not just for what he had lost, but for what he believed the world had done to him, ignoring him, controlling him, making him feel powerless. Now, in this moment of utter chaos, he was taking back control in the most brutal of ways. Next, Simmons made his way to a local convenience store. The tension in the air was suffocating. A few people were inside, unaware that the man standing at the counter was a cold-blooded killer. He fired again, sending the store into chaos. But the terror didn't stop there. This wasn't an emotional outburst, nor was it an accident. This was methodical. He was taking his anger out on the world, piece by piece. After that, he headed straight for his former workplace. There was no logic to the stops he made, no clear pattern in his targets. They were simply places that had once been familiar to him, now tainted by years of rage and frustration. And when he arrived at his old job, Simmons opened fire again, injuring more people, some of whom would carry the scars of that day for the rest of their lives. It was at this point that the town began to realize something was terribly wrong. Police had already been alerted, but Simmons had planned his rampage with cold precision. He moved with purpose, taking advantage of the chaos he had created to escape notice, for a time. As the rampage stretched on, it became clear that this wasn't just a random act of violence. This was a calculated attempt to make the world pay for the crimes he believed had been done to him. To Simmons, the people he shot weren't innocent bystanders. They were symbols of a world that had oppressed him, a world that had somehow forced him into a corner. And now he was determined to break free, by whatever means necessary. When police finally arrived, it was too late to stop the destruction Simmons had caused. He didn't flee. He didn't run. He didn't attempt to escape. Instead, he calmly walked into a police station. He simply walked up to the front desk, placed his hands on the counter, and surrendered. There was no struggle, no plea for mercy, no emotion. He had completed his task. He confessed immediately to the murders, but his reasoning was chilling. I was tired of being a slave to everyone. For him, this wasn't about rage or revenge, or even mental instability. It was about control. The control he had over his family for years. The control he believed he deserved over his own fate. And now, in his twisted mind, He had taken back that control in the most brutal, shocking way possible. But even as Simmons turned himself in, the full scale of his crimes remained a mystery. The bodies at his home were yet to be discovered. Law enforcement had no idea what they would find once they raided Mockingbird Hill. What they would uncover next would be even more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. Simmons' violent outbursts in Russellville were just the beginning of the truth. The real story, the real horror, was still waiting to be uncovered in the quiet, blood-stained halls of his home. It was a darkness so deeply embedded in his life that no one had seen it coming. After the arrest of Ronald Gene Simmons, the wheels of justice began to turn swiftly. The shocking scale of the murders he'd committed set the stage for one of the most chilling trials in Arkansas history. But as the trial progressed, it became clear that Simmons was not a man driven by panic or remorse. He was a man determined to face the consequences with an eerie indifference. The trial began in early 1988, just a few months after Simmons' arrest, and it quickly drew the eyes of the public, captivated by the gruesome details of the murders. The courtroom was filled with reporters, law enforcement officials, and even family members of the victims, yet through it all, Simmons seemed unaffected. His demeanor was unsettling. He sat at the defense table, often with his hands folded in front of him, staring straight ahead, his face devoid of any emotion. It was as if he were detached from the horror that had unfolded in his own home, as though he were watching someone else's nightmare play out on a screen. The prosecution presented a meticulously crafted case, revealing the full extent of Simmons' cold and calculated killings. They painted a disturbing portrait of a man who had methodically planned the massacre for days, each murder executed with chilling precision. He had killed his wife, children, grandchildren, and other relatives, one by one, often waiting for family members to return to the house before striking again. He had used various methods, bludgeoning his victims with blunt objects, shooting others, and even strangling a 3-year-old. The bodies were left to rot inside the house, where they remained hidden, covered by blankets, in the most unimaginable of circumstances. The details of the crimes were laid bare before the jury. The lack of remorse, the complete disregard for the lives of those who had once been his family. What was most terrifying was the fact that Simmons had spent several days living among the corpses of his victims, seemingly unaffected by the decay around him. He went about his daily routines, watching television, eating meals, and waiting for more family members to return so he could murder them too. He treated the lives of his loved ones as if they were expendable, as if their deaths were insignificant to him. This chilling detail struck at the heart of the case, leaving the jury and those in the courtroom shaken to the core. The defense, however, tried to paint a different picture. They acknowledged Simmons' brutal actions, but argued that his mental state was compromised by years of emotional abuse and repressed trauma. They pointed to the isolation he had subjected his family to, the control he exerted over them, and the alleged sexual abuse he had inflicted on his own daughter, Sheila. Simmons had been investigated for incest in the early 1980s, and although he was never formally charged, his behavior had been erratic and troubling. The defense suggested that this abuse, combined with Simmons' repressed emotional state and possibly underlying mental illness, might have contributed to the killings. But no amount of psychological defense could undo the cold facts of the case. The evidence was overwhelming. Family members testified to the abusive atmosphere within the household, where Simmons had exerted an iron grip over every aspect of their lives. Those who had escaped the house described a tense, oppressive atmosphere, one that made it nearly impossible for anyone to leave without incurring his wrath. Even the possibility of escape seemed unthinkable. Simmons' control was so absolute that those who lived under his roof had no hope of liberation, no avenue of support. It was a house of horrors, a prison where his power reigned unquestioned. As the trial neared its conclusion, the prosecution made one final powerful argument. Ronald Gene Simmons had not only taken the lives of his family members, he had destroyed the very fabric of their existence. He had obliterated their futures in cold blood, and no matter how much the defense tried to justify his actions, there was no excuse for what he had done. The jury deliberated for hours, but the outcome was inevitable. On March 11, 1988, Simmons was convicted on all 16 counts of capital murder. The courtroom, once filled with tension, now held an air of finality. It was clear to everyone in the room that the verdict had been reached in accordance with justice, though it hardly seemed to matter to Simmons. He sat motionless, unbothered, as the judge declared him guilty. The next stage of the trial was the sentencing phase, where the jury would decide whether to sentence Simmons to death or life in prison. But even here, Simmons seemed unconcerned with his fate. He gave no hint of emotion as the proceedings unfolded, showing no sign of remorse or regret. In fact, Simmons stunned the courtroom when he chose to waive his right to an appeal. He expressed no desire to delay his execution. This decision was shocking, especially considering the high-profile nature of the case, but it also revealed a chilling truth about Simmons. He had no interest in prolonging the inevitable. His apathy towards his fate was as disturbing as the murders he had committed. He simply wanted it over. Simmons was sentenced to death by lethal injection. His decision to forego an appeal ensured that his execution would come quickly. The date was set, June 25, 1990. Just 2 years after the murders, Ronald Gene Simmons would face his final moments. And on that day, the state of Arkansas carried out its sentence. In a rare instance, a man who had shown no remorse for his actions would not be given the chance to prolong his life any further. At 47 years old, Simmons was executed in the same method he had used in the lives of his own family, swiftly, without hesitation. His death marked the final chapter in one of the most disturbing cases of familicide ever recorded. The Mockingbird Hill massacre had come to a close, but the questions lingered. What could have driven a man to take the lives of his own flesh and blood with such precision? Why had he shown no remorse, no signs of emotional conflict? The answers remain a chilling mystery. What could possibly drive a man to commit such a horrific act? To systematically end the lives of 16 people, including his own children, grandchildren, and wife? What kind of psychological state must one be in to reach such depths of violence? And why did Ronald Gene Simmons, an ordinary man, a military veteran, become the orchestrator of one of the most horrifying massacres in American history? To understand the depths of Simmons' madness, we must explore more than just the details of the massacre itself. We must dig into his psyche, understand his background, his relationships, and the environment he fostered in his home. The pieces of this tragedy don't simply fall into place. They are the product of years of manipulation, control, and a warped sense of power that simmered quietly in the background of his life, waiting for the right moment to explode. Ronald Gene Simmons' background is key to understanding the dark evolution of his behavior. He spent 22 years in the U.S. Air Force, a man of discipline, structure, and authority. A man who was trained to follow orders and to command respect. But over time, Simmons' idea of discipline twisted. While the military helped him hone his skills, it also exacerbated the power dynamics that would later fuel his actions. He was used to being in control of himself, of his surroundings, and most critically, of the people around him. And when he retired from the military, he found himself in a situation where his need for control became absolute. In 1979, Simmons relocated his family to Dover, Arkansas, far away from the chaos of city life, into a secluded property known as Mockingbird Hill. It was a rural retreat, a place where Simmons could live in isolation with his family, free from the interference of the outside world. But beneath the idyllic surface of his new life, things were far from normal. He wasn't just a husband and father, he was a self-appointed ruler over his family, with absolute power over every aspect of their lives. This wasn't just control, it was a prison of his own making, and everyone in it was bound to his will. At first, the family lived in relative isolation, cut off from most of the outside world. They had no telephone, no modern conveniences, no way to call for help. And it was here, in this confined space, that Simmons' unhealthy obsession with control began to manifest. He began to micromanage every detail of his family's existence. The psychological abuse was relentless, and the emotional toll on his children was evident. His wife, Rebecca, and their 7 children were constantly under his thumb, forced to live under strict rules, with little room for autonomy. But Simmons wasn't just controlling. His behavior was far more disturbing. His relationship with his children, particularly his daughter Sheila, took a dark turn when he began to engage in incestuous acts. These horrific acts of abuse were not isolated incidents, they were systematic, deeply rooted in the toxic atmosphere he had created in his home. And perhaps even more chilling is the fact that, while some might argue he knew what he was doing was wrong, Simmons himself never saw his actions as immoral. Instead, he justified his behavior as part of his absolute right to dominate those around him. When the allegations of incest first surfaced in the early 1980s, Simmons' response wasn't one of fear or remorse. Instead, he grew more paranoid. To him, the threat of being exposed was the only real threat to his perfect, controlled world. So, he moved his family to a different location, believing that his actions were not only acceptable but justified. He didn't stop to think about the lives he was destroying in the process. He only focused on maintaining control of his family, his image, and his power. The escalating abuse, combined with his increasing paranoia, set the stage for what would unfold in December 1987. It wasn't just that Simmons killed his family, it was the way he killed them. His approach was calculated, methodical, and frighteningly cold. The murders didn't occur in a frenzied burst of rage. They were planned, staged, and carried out with an eerie detachment. On December 22, Simmons began his killing spree, first taking the life of his wife, Rebecca, and then his son, Ronald Jr., followed by his granddaughter, Barbara. But it wasn't a simple act of violence. It was a carefully orchestrated plan. The killings weren't committed out of immediate anger. Simmons had been living with the idea of murder for days. His home was already filled with the corpses of his loved ones, hidden in plain sight as he continued living in a facade of normalcy, as though nothing was out of place. He ate his meals, watched TV, and waited for more relatives to arrive so he could kill them too. By the time his other children and their families arrived for what was supposed to be a joyful Christmas gathering, Simmons was prepared. He had already executed several family members, and the moment they walked through the door, they were met with the same fate. His daughter Sheila, her husband, and their children were all killed, one by one, until Simmons had wiped out nearly everyone in his family. But what is even more disturbing is that he didn't just kill them out of spite or revenge. He killed them to retain control. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was a man who believed that the lives of his family members were his to control, to end whenever he saw fit. Their deaths were an extension of the suffocating grip he had on their lives, a final attempt to reassert his authority over them, even in death. After the murders were complete, Simmons didn't act like a man who had just committed a mass slaughter. He was not shaken, nor was he filled with remorse. Instead, he calmly waited. He knew the consequences would eventually catch up with him, but he didn't fear that. What he feared most was losing control, and in his mind he had regained it, not just over his family, but over everything that had ever been a threat to his perfect controlled world. Even when Simmons went on his shooting spree in Russellville targeting former coworkers and acquaintances, it wasn't an act of random violence, it was another attempt to assert his power, to punish the world that he believed had wronged him. In his mind, he wasn't just punishing his family, he was punishing everyone who had ever challenged his authority. The true tragedy of Ronald Gene Simmons is that he wasn't a madman in the traditional sense. He wasn't driven by an uncontrollable urge for violence. Instead, he was driven by something much more insidious, a deep, consuming need for control. He was a man who had built his life on the belief that everything and everyone around him belonged to him. His family wasn't just a part of his life, they were his property. And when he was no longer able to maintain that control, he chose to destroy it all. Simmons' crimes serve as a chilling reminder of how unchecked power and emotional abuse can warp a person's sense of reality, how the boundaries of right and wrong can become blurred when someone believes they have the right to rule others, and how, in the end, those who live in isolation, whether physically or emotionally, can become the most dangerous to themselves and to those around them. Ronald Gene Simmons' massacre didn't just take the lives of his family, it shattered the peace of a small Arkansas town, leaving behind a legacy of horror that still lingers today. His cold, methodical killing spree serves as a chilling reminder of how easily someone can slip through the cracks, hiding a lifetime of violence under the guise of normalcy. By the time law enforcement discovered the full extent of his crimes, it was too late. Simmons had already taken everything: his family, his reputation, and his own chance at redemption. Though he was executed by lethal injection in 1990, the story of Ronald Gene Simmons continues to haunt us, asking us all one uncomfortable question: how much can we truly know about the people closest to us? And while the case may be closed, the haunting truth of the Mockingbird Hill massacre is far from forgotten. If you found this story chilling, don't forget to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe for more deep dives into true crime cases that demand to be heard. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Simmons' actions were the result of years of abuse, or was there something darker at play? We'd love to hear from you.